So we're here in Mumbai at the World Economic Forum. The big issue is the Indian economy. And India had experienced its own economic revolution 20 years ago, the 1991 liberalization. Has it been a success?
If you belong to the top 1 to 3%, it's been an unprecedented success. If you belong to the bottom 70%, it's been an unmitigated disaster. So you take your pick. Where you stand depends on where you're sitting.
How can it have been such a polarizing reform? We hear about millions of Indians being lifted out of poverty. Hasn't that happened?
Well, actually, in the last 4 years, let me give you some numbers. In the last 4 years, 2007 to 2011, the government of India has officially constituted 3 committees to go into the extent of poverty. Now, these were ideologically very divergent committees. In India, the custom is governments can appoint any number of committees on the same subject until they get the report they want. Well, these 3 diverged enormously, but all 3 had one thing in common. They told the government its rural poverty figures needed to be revised sharply upwards. 1. 2, the latest United Nations Human Development Report is out, 2011, which looks at poverty in terms of the Human Development Index, in terms of the multidimensional poverty index, okay, and in terms of inequality, especially gender inequality in this lot. India today has 55 billionaires on the Forbes list. That's more than all the Scandinavian and Nordic countries put together. Maybe actually more than double, twice the number of billionaires that the Nordic and Scandinavian countries have. The same country ranks 134th when it comes to human development. Its rank in the gender inequality index is even worse because the number of countries, the field narrows and it comes to 129 out of 146. Even our human development value, which is 0.548, you factor in inequality, it falls 30%. So the big growth story has been that of inequality. It's grown faster than anything, and it's grown faster than at any time in the past 50 years.
So how has this economic liberalization worked? Why has it been so good for the top 1% or the top 3%?
I think that's hardly a mystery, Christina. It's not limited to India. The United States is a perfect representation of the same process over the last 25, 30 years, a longer period of theirs, and you're seeing the kind of protest movements that you have, whether it's Occupy Wall Street or wherever, that's coming up all over the world. It's coming up across the European Union. Inequality is the big issue in the world today. That's how the slogans are coming, 1% versus 99%. Okay? So this has been a stupendous success. But let's look at the WEF, which is working here for, say, 2 days. Now, the creme de la creme of the Indian economic miracle will be present here. In the same 48 hours that the WEF meets in Mumbai, typically based entirely on government data, which are huge, gross underestimates, in the same 48 hours that the WEF holds its meeting, 94 Indian farmers will commit suicide. Between 800 and 1,000 will attempt it. 4,000 Indian farmers will quit agriculture altogether. I'm giving you the average on the census figures between 91 and 2001. We don't have the latest data. But we do have the latest data on the farm suicides, which is that since 1995, over 250,000 farmers have committed suicide in this country. And in the last 8 years, it's happening at the rate of 1 every 30 minutes on average. Okay? In the same 48 hours, the government of India will write off direct income tax for corporates, direct corporate income tax, worth 4,800 million rupees, which is about the same amount that would have left the country for overseas destinations, overseas bank destinations without paying taxes, according to the Washington-based think tank on tax justice called Global Financial Integrity. So, yes, there are people who have done spectacularly well out of the 20 years. I'm one of them. It depends on the class strata you belong to. Now, as the editor of South Asia's biggest tabloid and the biggest one outside Japan in the 90s, I couldn't afford any of in the 80s, I couldn't afford any of the things that I could as a freelancer in the 90s and earlier this decade. So it's benefited people like me. It's benefited much more it's benefited people above my pay grade. Okay? It has not benefited the largest number of people whom the government's National Commission for Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector says live 836 million people who live on less than 50 cents US a day.
You've spoken, Sainath, about this inequality, this polarization, as being a global problem, as being something in the U.S. as much as an issue in India. Do you think those you talked about, the Indian creme de la creme who are here in Mumbai in this fine hotel, the 55 billionaires?
Publicly funded. Because as I said, in these 48 hours, they get 4,800 rupees tax write-offs in just direct corporate income tax. Apart from that, they get millions and millions more in customs and excise write-offs. Your creme de la creme is entirely a public-funded phenomenon.
Do you think that they have more in common with each other than they do with the poor people in their own countries?
Well, I think that the Indian elite are as much foreigners to their country as those visiting Mumbai for the summit. But let me.
First, give me an example. Why do you say that?
They have absolutely no connection. Now, in this city, I said India has $55 billionaires. We had 8 6 years ago. Okay, we've been climbing steadily. In other countries, many other countries, it's fallen, but in India, it's risen. Above us, there's only the United States, China, and Russia, and we scoff at the Chinese and Russians. Their billionaires' net asset worth is a mere $2 billion apiece. Our guys are about 3.75.
Yours are better.
Much richer, and then unlike the Russians, you see, at the end of 10 years, we don't send all our billionaires to prison. We send ours to parliament. Okay, so they're doing well. Thank you. The thing in this city, you will find the world's costliest personal residence built in living memory. It's between $1.5 and $2 billion. It's owned by Mr. Mukesh Ambani. It's called Antilla. And after spending about $1.5 billion on it, he's not moved into it because the astrologers told him that the Vastu, that is the Indian equivalent of Feng Shui, is not right. So I guess they've got to spend another $500 million setting that right. So he goes there and has his parties and his cocktails and his dinner parties, but he doesn't sleep there at night. He hasn't moved in because the Feng Shui isn't right. In that same amount, you could do the redevelopment of the world's largest slum in Dharavi and have enough left over to tackle many of the other slums in the city where, by the way, 1 in every 8 Indian children, urban children, lives in a slum.
So sorry.
Yeah.
Overcome. Carry on.
So you have that kind of disparity in this city. In what way is that residence, that lifestyle, connected with the masses of a city, over 55% of whom live in the streets and in the slums, and another 20-30% in single-room tenements with large families?
Has there been any trickle down at all? Has the Indian economic miracle helped the remaining 99% or 97% in any way?
I think prosperity, well, yes, in the sense of a very limited percentage between the 1% and the 10%. I belong to the 10%. As I said, I've benefited, which raises the question of why then am I criticizing the process? Because I think it's utterly inhuman and anti much larger numbers of Indians than myself. So you have the choice. You can make the most of what you're getting out of it, or you can choose to protest, or you can choose to dissent from this process of enrichment. Now, the latest US tax data, the latest US census data show us an almost identical process. In the first time in the West in 50 years, you're seeing the middle classes take a huge hit, so it's making a noise. It didn't create a noise when it was the poor getting shafted. It's when the middle classes start. Here, the upper middle classes are doing fairly well, thank you. So they're not in a mood yet to start making a noise about it.
Is the global economy causing this in some way? If we're seeing it global effects that are similar?
Well, yes, and in some ways, India is much worse because let me give you an example. India has the highest number of malnourished children in the planet. Now, the rate of malnourishment, the rate of undernourishment in Indian children is 46% according to the National Family Health Survey of this country. Do you know what the average for sub-Saharan Africa is between 25 and 30%? We're almost double. The Global Hunger Index, of which you may have heard, comes out of the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C. The IFPRI runs a thing called the Global Hunger Index, which rates countries in terms of great hunger and malnourishment, including child malnourishment and underweight children. Out of 84 countries, hungry countries, India ranks 67. Our position on the Global Hunger Index, the value of our GHI is worse than it was 15 years ago. Our malnourishment of children is close to double that of sub-Saharan Africa, but sub-Saharan Africa does not have our billionaires. So the division is more stark.
Are the billionaires to blame, though?
I'm saying that this entire process, like anywhere else in the world, is policy driven. It's a billionaire's world. Now, firstly, allow me to question the seriousness of the exercise we call the World Economic Forum. When have these guys got anything right in all these years of their meetings? Dean Baker put it so beautifully some time ago. They're going to make a number of economic forecasts. As Dean Baker, the American economist, put it so well, he said the difference between economic forecasters on the one hand and dishwashers and cab drivers on the other hand is that the latter two categories get punished for bad performance. There is absolutely no danger of your career prospects being affected in any way if you're an economic forecaster who gets every single thing wrong every single day. These were the guys who a few months before 2008, September, the meltdown of Wall Street, told us that things had never been better. I mean, what credit, for me, as far as I'm concerned, both from the point of view of entertainment and audience watching, these sham wrestling matches they have on television where, Neanderthals full of steroids exterminate Cro-Magnons full of nothing. They're funnier. They have some entertainment value, and everybody who's watching knows it's a fake. The WEF guys take themselves seriously. And indeed, we should take them seriously, but not for the reasons they take themselves seriously.
So why should we take them seriously?
Because they have driven the policies that have caused this destruction. The neoliberal philosophies that have dominated the world. In the world, there have been, say, across the world, when you ask, is it the same? Yes. There have been 8 or 10 processes that are absolutely the same across the world. It's the McDonald's economics. It tastes the same everywhere. The impact will be different because, say, the impact on American farmers is very bad on family farms, not corporate farms, because it happens in the interest of corporate farmers. But the impact on Indian small farmers will be much worse because their living standards are very different. But the principles are the same. One, the last 25, 30 years have seen the withdrawal of the state from sectors that matter to poor people. Two, a steady transfer of resources from poor to rich. You can see that in the United States. You can see that in the data I gave you on tax write-offs while people are killing themselves. Three, you have what I call the privatization of just about everything, including intellect and soul. So you have these thousands of analysts and forecasters and academics and top journalists all buying into this phenomenon of building a separate Xanadu in which they live. Planet WEF is a very different one from that which the rest of the world inhabits.
Talk to me about this privatization of intellect and of Planet WEF. What's happening? What is this planet?
There are two aspects to it. One is that 30, 40 years ago, there were lots more. There were lots more top intellectuals who were dissenters from the dominant processes in politics and economics. In the last 30 years, what I've seen is, let me put it this way, 15, 20 years ago, I used to wonder what this word public intellectual means. I find myself referred to as such. Then one day I realized, I guess they call us that because everybody else has become private intellectuals.
What's a private intellectual?
With the think tanks, the policy groups, the lobby groups, the guy, the suits, meeting in green room and back room conferences to decide what policies the world should follow, and then having the wherewithal through so-called multilateral institutions to impose those policies. Privatization, liberalization, globalization. What has it meant for millions of people? For cotton farmers in India, for instance, India is the second largest cotton producer in the world. For cotton farmers in India, it's meant having to face gigantic United States and EU subsidies in cotton, which has destroyed, incidentally, cotton farmers whose prices have crashed over the last 15 years are the largest single group in the farmers' suicides in this country. Okay? So we're very closely linked to what happens. Their subsidies in 2000, as early as 2003, the presidents of Mali and Burkina Faso wrote a letter which published in the New York Times. I think it was July 11, 2003. The headline of that story was, your subsidies are strangling our people. Okay, so these subsidies of the United States and European Union for agriculture have devastated millions of small and poor farmers in the rest of the world. So we're very closely linked, but we're not benefiting the same way as they are. Now the Indian elite couldn't care less. They want there are Indian textile lobbies which love that subsidized cotton that comes. It comes with very generous terms of credit, and therefore it depresses the price of the local farmer who is already on the breadline. So you're linked globally, you're seeing all sorts of things. On the other hand, I have been saying for the last several years, as I mentioned in Edmonton several times, in fact, the public lecture I gave in Edmonton this June was on inequality and the unraveling of neoliberal globalization. Now, within a month of that, everything else has happened. Right? Anywhere you look in the world today, the Greeks are talking about inequality. The Italians will be talking about it a month from now. The Irish, the Portuguese, the Spaniards, they're all talking about inequality. You had a day of solidarity with OWS, Occupy Wall Street, that occurred simultaneously in between 800 and 1,500 towns across the world according to different estimates. The low end is 800. I'm trying to say, if they cannot even now, if the WEF even cannot see now that their world, their planet is unsustainable, they're doomed, which is okay with me, but the tragedy is that we go first. The rest of it goes down the tube first.
You've talked about this neoliberal ideology and this neoliberal intellectual class. Is it really a global phenomenon rather than a national one?
Pretty much. Well, of course, if you take very tiny island nations which have virtually no elite, that's another thing. But if you're talking about the big countries, you're talking about, say, outside the G7, if you're also then talking about India, China, Brazil, South Africa, these are all countries where inequality has gone up. That's why I'm saying the difference between the inequality growth story and the growth story they're interested in, inequality is the one indicator that has seen no dip. Their growth stories have seen dips and crashes, like in 2008. Inequality is a steadily rising graph which sparks off the kind of problem you're seeing. So, Edward Abbey, the late American ecologist, put it very beautifully when questioning the idea of growth. What was growth? Was it meant to tell us that people are doing better in health? It was not any of these things. It was a simple measurement of economic activity. It said nothing about public benefit. So you have to look at what is the composition, the nature of growth. Is it growth with justice, growth through justice, distributive growth, monopoly growth? As Abby put it, growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell. That grows 9% this year, 20% next year, and next year I'm dead. Right? I think that's the kind of growth you've been looking at. And it's not sustainable. It is simply not sustainable. You can do it for 10 years, you can do it for 12 years. Then you really run into problems, as India will run India's already run into them. But it's become, see, the mantra, this neoliberalism, and what I call, and since 91 have called market fundamentalism. It's as much a religion as any other, and more fundamentalist in many ways because it's pan-religions. Okay? The simple thing that governments are required to do, the only indicator by which governments are judged is the growth numbers. Now look at the fact that this figure of 250,000 farm suicides was on the front page of the country's second most widely read English daily, right? Who picked it up? Outside of the newspaper on whose front page I put it, it's government data, National Crime Records Bureau. In this country, suicide is a crime. You get punished for doing it. Okay, so attempted suicide is a crime. So even that doesn't shake up the discussion, because they're just at another plane in another planet. And then there's us, the mass media, the journalists, public intellectuals of another kind. The dominant feature of mass media across the world is the same. The phenomenal and growing disconnect between mass media on the one hand and mass reality on the other.
To what do you attribute that disconnect? Why do you think the media is
Who are the
missing
media?
reality?
The media, the dominant media, and I think the United States gives you the best example of all, along with Australia, I suppose. The dominant media are entirely corporate owned. There are very few countries in the world that still remain with a strong public broadcaster, and all of them are under severe assault, whether it's the CBC, whether it's BBC, or whether it's Australians ABC. The public broadcaster is under severe assault. Look how many decades it took for Murdoch to be exposed. Only a couple of million people knew what he was doing. Okay, but the power of that. So it's a corporate media. It's a fully corporatized media. As much, it's in fact, I would call it the ideological arm of the neoliberal campaign. And those of us who work in the mainstream media are left with choices. You know, at least if we live in democracies, we are left with this choice when the situation of corporatization happens. Will we be journalists or will we be stenographers? I would say that the bulk of, American and Western journalism consists of stenography. And that same phenomenon is growing even more rapidly in India, but it's still got distance to cover. So do I want to be a stenographer or do I want to be a journalist? And it's not, by the way, when I keep saying this about stenography and journalism, and some time ago, a very old gentleman in the audience got up and criticized me very bitterly and entirely on legitimate grounds. He said, "Sir, you keep making this sarcastic connection between journalists and stenographers." He said, I was a court stenographer for more than 30 years. As a stenographer in the court, I took down honestly what everybody said. The prosecution, the defense, the witness, the judge, I took down everything. You guys take down only what your bosses tell you, only what you are stenographers to the powerful.
You have spoken very eloquently about the shortcomings of market fundamentalism or neoliberalism. But is there an alternative? Part of the reason the 1991 revolution happened in India was the collapse and the discrediting of Soviet communism. So maybe this is the only way to run things.
It's certainly the best way to ruin things. If you look at the 1991 speech that Dr. Manmohan Singh, then finance minister, made, he made a number of points about why it was necessary. All those points are alive and worse today. He said, we have to take drastic action. The poor of this country are facing double-digit inflation. That's what they're facing now. He said food prices are too high. Food prices are at an all-time high now. Each of the justifications he gave you, things are a lot worse now except the growth numbers. Okay. And it's part of what was called the chaos theory, the opportunist chaos theory of ideologues of the World Bank and the IMF, that when there's a crisis in a country, that's when you push through your agenda. That's exactly what happened in this country. Okay. Now, if in 20 years of liberalization, it has not made a dent on child malnourishment, while you've put together $55 billionaires and, by the way, $157,000 millionaires, okay? But you haven't dropped child malnourishment by 3%. Something is seriously wrong with your miracle. If the number of people not seeking health due to financial reasons has more than doubled in that period, there is something, and that's a government figure, there is something very seriously wrong in that. If your neonatal mortality rate is still the highest the numbers of women who die in that period are still the largest absolute number in the world, there's something wrong with that. If the United Nations Development Programme's multi-dimensional poverty index tells us that 612 Indians are in poverty, there's something wrong with that. Now we can celebrate forever the fact or the claim that 60 to 70% of Indians have mobile phones. I would rather look at the fact that about the same percentage do not have bank accounts.
Do you support the Anna Hazare protest movements?
I have known Anna Hazare and his activities for a very long time. I think he's a well-intentioned person, and I think his personal intentions in that whole movement were pretty honest. I do not think that they will even touch the structural corruption embedded in our policies. The definition of corruption never ever included, their definition of the Anna Hazare team's definition of corruption never included, never encompassed the biggest phenomenon of the world, and particularly in India, which is corporate corruption. Okay, it was about the guy at the railways, the clerk at the railway station, ripping you off for $50 to give you a ticket. It was about the kind of corruption that the middle classes find particularly irritating. But it's not about the corruption that allows corporate concessions worth 2,400 million rupees a day in just income tax, in just tax write-offs for the corporates, which is the current budget figure. So it could not hope, it could never hope to tackle the sources of corruption. It was what it does is the kind of thing that they wanted to do polices corruption. It does not address the well springs of it. And there are three in India. One is the structural embedded corruption in India. Two is that driven by policy, which is the main thing. Okay, it's like trying to mop the floor dry with all the taps open and running.
And what are those taps in India?
Well, one is our structural corruption, as I said, which are those of the inequities, structural inequalities of Indian society, which include class, gender, caste. All these are and ownership of assets and resources. These are embedded structural inequalities. The second is, the main thing in our time are the policies that have enriched a particular section of people to such a level that inequality in India is greater than at any time in its history after the British Raj. Okay? Those are the neoliberal policies of privatization, liberalization, destroying the public sector, millions of people losing their jobs. The third source is what is linked to the first source. The third source is what I call in India the culture of impunity and arbitrariness. I treat the driver in a particular way, I can get away with it. I can do anything because I'm powerful and influential in society, and I get away with it. Okay? It's a culture of impunity and arbitrariness. So these are the three sources. These are the three main tabs. There are others, but these are fundamentally, they cover most of that canvas.
And do you think inhabitants of what you call planet WEF tend to have this feeling of impunity?
Oh, entirely. Look, why would I not have that feeling of impunity if I was a Wall Street banker? I brought the planet down, which is the prosecution that has sent one of us to prison in any appreciable sentence. You've punished poor people. There are 10 million people facing foreclosures in that country. Okay? You've punished them. And the guys who did it, you've rewarded them. So why should I not feel the power of impunity? Why should I not enjoy it, and why should I not exercise it? I would feel, I would, if I were one of them, feel much stronger today than I did in October 2008 when the lynch mobs were out. Right? John McCain would have won his election. He could have beaten Obama in only one way. In only one way. Had he said, in my first 100 days in the White House, I propose to bring 100 indictments against the criminals of Wall Street, you might have had a different election.
What about the Occupy Wall Street movement? Is that going to make a difference?
I think it's a qualitatively different protest movement from anything we have seen in many years. I think it's like what in the media, the qualitatively different thing that has happened in the last 30 years is WikiLeaks. In politics and economics, Occupy Wall Street is qualitatively different. Now we can go on forever, as the mainstream media do, after ignoring them for 3 weeks. Okay? On how naive they are. They haven't got a program, they haven't got a leader, they've got no coherence. You know what they got? One thing they got right, they got the address right. And that's half the story. They got the damned address right. They are saying, they're not saying we have a problem. They are saying you are the problem. And we are here to confront the guys who are the problem. That, it doesn't matter to me if that movement peters out over the winter and the cold. It doesn't matter if it dissolves with, it's lit a candle. And you're seeing that candle burning now in Greece, Portugal, Spain, let alone the third world where it has been burning for decades. Okay? So even it's done its job. It's sharply focused it. It's sharply focused the issue of inequality and that polarization we began by talking about. So it's not necessary that it have a great spokesman, a giant brain or an intellectual. And even that, I think that they have, do they have a lot of problems and weaknesses? Of course. I have never known a movement which didn't. But I'm saying they've done their job. They've shown us, okay, this is where you send your complaint.
And what is the solution? What should the agenda be, the positive agenda? Is there one?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, in India, I could give it to you policy by policy. But largely, there is absolutely no choice, but to curb monopoly ownership over the resources of the world. There is no choice. And it's by no means the first time the world will have done this. It happened in the early 1900s, 1912, when the House of Rockefeller threatened to get more powerful than the White House. Standard Oil was broken into 7 little companies, remember, into the 7 sisters. In the 1940s, many of the large corporations of the West collaborated with Hitler and the Nazis during World War II. You have enormous records of this, especially in the Pulitzer Prize winning author's book, Trading with the Enemy by Charles Hyan, which book has not been reviewed by about 1,000 newspapers in North America, though it's more than 20 years old now. At the end of the war, very serious restrictions on monopoly were brought in the United States and North America. In United States, the most visible restrictions were brought in on Hollywood. When you broke the monopoly that allowed you to be the filmmaker, the producer, the studio, and the distributor. All these very serious restrictions were set up. Okay? In media, it came up in cross-ownership restrictions, which exist in your country, which exist in Canada, which exist in the United States, they don't exist in India. Okay? All these restrictions from the 1980s began to collapse under Thatcher and Reagan, what you call, Reaganomics or Thatcherite neoliberalism. So it's not as if we are exploring unknown terrain. In some respects, you are restoring status quo ante. Right? Now, you didn't do it, and you got Murdoch. Right? Now you're going to have, if the British are serious, it's not just one news of the world that is to blame. Forget it. Hundreds of other newspapers are doing exactly the same thing. Right? You need to curb the power of monopoly. That there's a culture of impunity. If News of the World did it, they thought they could get away with it, and they were absolutely correct in believing that. They got away with it for a very long time until they went and did it to a little murdered girl, and that blew the bottom out from under their feet. Right? So it's not a one. Anti-monopoly legislation, whether in media or in industry, there's no way. And it's not that it's new. You have enormous precedents in each and every one of the countries that is pondering the problem. That's one. Second is far more public involvement and action in policy making and participation in what's happening. Now in the United States, many of what those Wall Street occupiers are telling you is, we want a voice in who runs the country. We want a voice in how the country is run. And that's why did the Greeks pull back from their referendum? Oh, how awful to let those people on the street tell us what they think. Right? But you're going to see that it's going to be forced, that situation will come up. I believe that the present crisis is a drama in many parts. We're only in Act 2. How many acts does it have? I have no idea. And I don't want to be like the economic forecaster, though I believe I got some things right in the last few years about inequality. Like I spoke about it in Edmonton, saying this is the number one problem in June. So there are solutions. And in India, for instance, is a very strong constitution-based solution. Very strong. I think, by the way, in the West, there's got to be a new charter of citizens' rights, a Bill of Rights, of citizens' rights. Now, Canada is a very privileged and very different country from the United States. Canada is pretty much, most of the last 20 years, at the top of the Human Development Index. But you want to look at the inequality. Take the First Nations out of Canada. Canada could be, I think, in the top 6 or 7 of the Human Development Index. The First Nations would rank at about 70. Okay, that's the gap. There's inequality, yes, even in Canada, and income inequality since 2002 has grown pretty sharply in your country. So you have within your own history a number of policies, measures, actions, programs by which you brought down that inequality in the first place. So we shouldn't look so naive and injured, innocent about how do we do it. There's plenty of ways in which you can do it. In the Indian Constitution is a chapter that comes after the fundamental rights. It's called the Directive Principles of State Policy. I believe that if we implement that charter, you've got a revolution on your hands in this country. And I believe it's a pretty good charter for people anywhere because of the entitlements it orders, it mandates the state to give importance to on citizens' health, income, nutrition, work conditions, labor, employment. So you follow that, and every one of the countries, your country, all these countries have huge precedents in those. How did Canada was not always number 1 or number 5 in the global, in the Human Development Index. It reached there by certain policy measures and by other factors. So you can search in your own strengths, in your own society for the answers. But one answer is common. You cannot increase inequality and hope to tackle these problems. You can't do that.
One last question, Sainath. How do you explain China? Inequality is also growing. It's still a communist country. Still a communist dictatorship.
I think that China's problem is severely underestimated. Okay? Because, the Chinese media being under the kind of control they are, and public discussion being under the kind of control there is, I believe actually the rest of us, the rest of the world, are underestimating the inequality divisions in China. Now, Chinese inequality has probably even grown faster than ours in certain respects, but it started from a much more even and egalitarian base. In some ways that makes it worse. Okay? In the China of 1970s, the gap between the top and the bottom was not very high. It was so you're having millions of people who knew an egalitarian living in their time facing extreme deprivation. Nowhere are we reading enough about the number of labor struggles, strikes, actions, work shutdowns, slowdowns, the protests outside the National Parliament, which is every year is drawing hundreds of thousands of people on the issue of inequality. The Chinese recognize this to some extent. In 2006 or 5, the NPC, that is the National Parliament of China, every year they put out priority decrees. Decree number 1, decree number 2, to give a sense of priority. Decree number 1 was inequality, reducing coastal versus interior area inequality. But I think they have pursued, and in terms of some of the policies that they have imported within themselves, I think those are not, in a sense, very different. They're operating on a different base, on an egalitarian base, but the principles are not very different from what's happened elsewhere. China has a huge problem if the United States goes down the tube. Who's holding all those dollars? Right? So we're all in it together.
Thank you very much, Sainath.
Welcome.